large contingency. We're in Dallas, Fort Worth, San Antonio, and Austin, Houston. And what we do is we celebrate the traditional side of architecture. And I like to say that it's not the worship of ashes, it is the carrying of a flame. And so we see that in the past that there's lessons learned. And so we're trying to carry those forward. And so I think you're going to find this lecture very interesting. Today we have Steve Mouzon. He's an author, and he's a couple of books, and one that I'm familiar with is called The Original Green. And this is where I really connect to him, because in traditional design we use materials that are sustainable, and I think that's where we're related. And so again, I want to thank you for coming, and if you have any questions, Valerie Wood is here today from Dallas. She can answer any of your questions. We have student memberships, and we'd love for you to join us. Thank you.
Thanks. Just real quickly, if you would, if you have your phone with you, if you don't mind pulling it out, turn it on, and feel free to tweet cast this if you like. I'm at Steve Mouzon, and Original Green is a hashtag you might could use if you want to. But anyway, but this is going to be just a fire hose of information. So I have all this stuff on the bottom of every slide in case you want to pick it up later on. It's a lot of the ideas here are out of the Original Green book, which came out in what was it, 2010, I guess it was. But there's a lot of stuff in here that's new as well, because they keep trying to move the ideas forward. The basic proposition of the Original Green is it's keeping things going in a healthy way long into an uncertain future. If you can't do that, it doesn't matter how many lead points you get or whatever, or accolades or whatever the case might be. If you can't keep things going, it cannot be sustained. So what is the Original Green? Let's talk real quickly, because there's several misconceptions that have come up in recent years. First of all, it's not all low tech. I have well, it was the latest MacBook Pro. I'm probably going to upgrade here shortly, but I love things that help me work really well. So some of those things are high-tech things. But it's also not just Gizmo Green. Now, Gizmo Green is the proposition that with better equipment and better materials, we can achieve sustainability. As we'll see, that is a part of the role, but it's actually a fairly small part of what true sustainability actually is. It's also not just historical. Just because it's old and been there for a long time, it's fine to sustain those buildings, but we must be creating new as well. So when you mention the T word, or the T-bomb, it's almost like dropping the F-bomb in other audiences, if you're talking to a bunch of architects. But actually, we don't really understand tradition very well, because we haven't actually experienced it in our lifetimes. And so, if you think about a habit is something you do repeatedly, whereas a tradition is something you do repeatedly because you love to. Love is the difference in the two of those. And so here's how it actually works. It begins by a single insight by one person about how to build something better. They build that. If that resonates with enough other people around in their locality, then they repeat it. Repeat it enough, it becomes a local pattern. And then if the people in the region in which that locality exists, if they say, hey, we love this thing, we want to adopt it into our family of regional traditions, they do. And so illustrating again how love is the key of this in not just history. There's another way of doing exactly one from the very starting point to the ending point, and that is somebody has this insight. If they can transmit that into a hive of like-minded individuals, then the insight becomes a cause. And then if they can actually get outside that hive to the public at large, it becomes a movement. And then if that movement crosses generational boundaries, it reaches the highest level of ideas to spread, which is a living tradition. So just want to be kind of clear on what this is. Like I say, the living traditions all died about 100 years ago, close to it. I would actually not quite that long, I would actually maintain that the last living tradition to die in architecture was Art Deco right at the end of World War II. And Today, of course, because we're not familiar with actually seeing the workings of a living tradition, you know, this was once a living creature. Okay, it's a fossil, and this is a living creature. That's my dog, but there's about as much similarity between a fossil and a living creature as there is between a dead tradition and a living one. It's just a very different thing. This is a worldwide diagram of the Blogosphere. The Blogosphere is a very vibrant living tradition that has sprung up just in the last decade or so. And you know, it's self-organized, and today there's millions of people that blog, and probably tens or hundreds of millions of people that actually read their stuff every day. And so, but the good news is I think that by connecting many people, a richly connected network, we're actually setting the stage for us to have living traditions in architecture and urbanism again, because it's not just delivered top-down, but it's wisdom that is shared by many. The Great Decline occurred from about 1925 to 1945. During that time, and it's not just in architecture. I've told this story to many other people of many other disciplines, and they said, you know, this Great Decline was happening in my field as well, and they name off a number of different fields over the years. Now, some of my classicist colleagues, they say, well, that was those nasty modernists that they caused the whole thing, but actually that's not the case, because most people do not live or work in places that look like this. They actually, during the dark ages of architecture, from 1945 to 1980, most of them lived in places that looked like this and worked in places that looked like that. Now, there's no Photoshop there. That's an actual business in Colorado. I believe that a new renaissance began about 1980. I peg it to that date because of the advent of Seaside at that time. And for the first quarter of a century or so, basically what was happening was it was just simply collecting wisdom again that had been lost. And, you know, a lot of us at that time were kind of like wandering around in the dark in the woods and hoping you're going to bump into something. We didn't know what we're looking for. We didn't know where to find it. We didn't know if it even still existed. But over time, we've recovered a lot of lost wisdom about how to build in a sustainable way. Now, during the second phase, which I believe started in about 2005, 2006, you started to see architecture take on a life of its own and evolve again in some of these little enclaves where people have been recollecting the lost wisdom, like it has always done. Architecture has always evolved. I believe I hope that this happens in my lifetime, but I think that there's a third phase, which is the high renaissance, where basically there's such a compelling body of work, of sustainable work, that architecture schools all over will say, we got to start teaching this stuff again. And I hope that happens. The recovery actually began by just simply making ourselves better, and that is we tried to relearn these things. That was the recovery of what was lost. And the next step is to try to make others better. We tried that through things like pattern books, a number of other devices like this, architectural toolkits. But really, the real trick, because now put the red square down here in Miami because that's where I live. But if the red square represented, if all American population was spread evenly across the country, the red square would be all the architects. Okay, so there's not enough of us to actually make everything better without engaging the people again. We really have to be able to engage the public and not just be a total top-down operation. So to do that, we have to share wisdom. Now, there's several ways of doing that. And let's look at the delivery system. Public education's way, you go K through 12, and after that, used to be there was the library, now there's the internet. And now that's very broad, because if you don't go to school, the truant officer comes and your parents get arrested, but it's not very high. Probably the cure to cancer won't be discovered by someone that only has a K through 12 education. Higher education's ways to take people higher, but it's not as broad. In most audiences, if you ask for a show of hands of how many PhDs in the room, it's certainly not the whole audience. As a matter of fact, usually it's a small proportion of the audience. The specialist way takes people even higher, but it's in even smaller silos. My son is a chef. He would know the difference between all these whisks. I have not a clue. Matter of fact, the specialists invent a language for their own specialty that makes it even more obscure so that people cannot get in. But nature has a way of spreading wisdom broadly and very high-level wisdom, which is what we have to be able to do, because you realize that There's millions of people around the world right now that are working to learn how to build sustainably again. We haven't figured that out yet. I'm an optimist to believe that we will do that. But when we do figure that out, then to spread that wisdom broadly that has taken so long to discover and with so much effort, it's got to be something that engages everyone, because it's about changing everyone's behavior, not just us delivering better buildings. Okay, so it has to involve behavior change. Here's the way that nature's way works. I'm going to say a trigger warning here, but follow me through to the end of this slide, and I think you'll be okay, I hope. If you were to look at this young woman sitting on the streets of Paris, having lunch with her friend, you might say she's attractive enough that she can probably attract a number of suitors with whom to share her genetic material, and so life passes on. But if you told her that, she'd say, yes, but there's so much more to me than that. I'm not just my appearance, and of course she'd be right. But what has happened is that what nature does is it's bound the greatest wisdom ever encountered, the human genome, it's packaged it in a very thin skin of what we all see and know about each other. And all someone needs to do, they do not need to be a genetics engineer to pass on genetic material. All they need to do is fall in love and then let nature take its course. And so that's what we've got to be able to do, something very similar. Somebody can study for 30 years for it to figure out the best possible eave to build in a particular region based on the sun angles and wind speeds and many other characteristics. If they expected everybody else to do all that work as well, it would never spread. If, however, they can embed that within a character of architecture that is lovable to people in that place, then it can spread broadly. Okay, so that's what we have to be able to do with sustainable things. The worst possible thing we can do is the necessity of uniqueness, which is the burden that architecture as a profession has borne for 100 years. Okay, because if once it's done, if you can't do that again, then nothing can pass on. Matter of fact, Zaha was criticizing Frank Gehry a couple of years ago. She said he is self-plagiaristic, meaning that he's copied work that he has done. You know, I mean that's kind of the extreme of that. We cannot do that with sustainability. It has to be able to spread broadly. The beginning of this, for me, is a matter of trying to figure this out. Happened in Mooresville, Alabama, in the day after Thanksgiving, 1980. My wife, my sister, her boyfriend at the time, and I had too much turkey to eat the day before. We said, let's go somewhere to walk. Well, Huntsville is a sprawl city where I live, and so there's nowhere to walk there, and so we had to drive 20 miles so we could walk in Mooresville. And walking around town that day, what we saw was, you know, we'd been told that we were going to be the greatest generation of architects ever. You know, we had computers now. Our builders had bigger power tools, and the mortgage companies had more clever mortgages. Of course, we know how that worked out. But anyhow, but walking around town that day, I had to come face to face with the fact that while this was not the best building built since the end of World War II by any stretch, but the place was a better place than had been built since the end of World War II. And it's like, and it was primarily built by simple farmers and tradespeople beginning in 1818, 40 years before an architect ever set foot in the state of Alabama, but yet it was a better place. How is that possible that they could do that? Well, you can understand once something gets started in place, that how it can continue with those same people, but how do you pass it down to the next generation? I didn't understand. I had no idea. I called it the transmission device of living traditions many years later on, but I still didn't understand it then. But I took the mystery home with me, kind of fed it and watered it, if you will. And almost 24 years later, at the very end of the design charrette, we'd had the celebratory dinner. The team was all in the parlor of the B&B where we're staying and saying our goodbyes. And someone asked Milton Grenfell, one of the architects on the team, who was originally from Mississippi. This is in Jackson, Mississippi. And I said, Milton, why is it that you have these bell-cast eaves here that come down and then they break? And he said, well, we do this because that here we have a lot of torrential rains. But if you let the rains come on, you know, and we need the roofs to be relatively steep because if they're not steep enough, they fail in uplift in a hurricane. If they're too steep, they'll fail in overturning. But anyhow, so they're relatively steep, 8 and 12, 9 and 12 in that range. And if torrential rains came off of a roof that steep, they would dig a trench in the yard, but we would put the kick out at the bottom. It kind of breaks it into more of a spray than just a sheet of water. And so that's why we did that. It took me a minute. Wait a minute, what do you say? How do you start off? We do this because that's it. That's it. That's what I've been looking for all of those years, because that explains what that does. If instead of saying, the proposition of traditional architecture at that time, I've written a number of pattern books myself, was thou shalt do this because I have better taste than you. Now some people will comply. You might get a draftsman to comply. You probably won't get an architect to comply. But some people do comply, but nobody's happy about it. And so that was a serious weakness. The architects said, well, you chained our wrist. We can't do anything. Well, but if you can look out onto the fields and the waters from which most of your food comes. Now, you'll always be able to get spices from around the world, but the main ingredients really ought to come from close nearby. One thing about inertial places, the only slide I'll have for that, but a big part of, if you read a lot of the writings of the early modernists, a big part of what they talked about was achieving the machine aesthetic in our buildings. I'm saying now that if we're building a nourishable place, it's very important to start thinking about an agricultural aesthetic, because right now a vegetable garden is about as beautiful as a laundry room, meaning not very. But the gardens need to be, everything about the agriculture needs to be lovable as well. An accessible place is one where you have a variety of means of gaining access to the place, especially including the self-propelled means of walking and biking, because no matter what the price of gas goes to, you'll always be able to get around. Now, this is the one that I want to have a little more to talk about, because there's several things that have come up in a book that I'm now writing called Walk Appeal that actually I think are important on the architectural side. Do you want a meal that's merely edible? Do you want a book that is merely readable? Of course not. You want things that are interesting and delicious and all this. And so why would we want a place that is merely walkable? A place where you can walk. Okay? Should we not instead want a place that we're drawn to walk there? Because if that's the case, we'll walk there a lot more. Now, for 30 years, we've been struggling to build walkable places again. That was the high standard back 30 years ago, 35 years ago, because most places were so hideously unwalkable. But now we've generally figured out how to do that. We need to go to the next step and build places with great walk appeal again. Now, places with walk appeal have even better bike appeal, because part of what we'll see is that how much do you entertain people by changing the view as they go by things. And of course, because a bike normally travels faster, then it's actually more interesting to bike there. This diagram is about a century old. It's a Perry diagram that has shaped countless neighborhoods that have been built since then. That basically says that an American will walk a quarter of a mile before they'll drive. But that actually is not, most of the time it's not true. Here's a quarter mile. At this power center, you'd be lucky to walk 100 feet. Matter of fact, you'll walk just as short a distance as you possibly can once you find a parking space. You may even wait for a minute or two for somebody else to pull out so you don't have to go 3 or 4 spaces further, not because you're terribly lazy, but because the experience is so hideous. Now, this is Rome turned sideways. Okay, so this is the Piazza del Popolo and the Vittorio Emanuele. There's a quarter of a mile. You'll walk that far and you'll keep on walking. Actually, you'll probably walk well past the Vittorio. There's several scales of walk appeal. W6 are the great streets where you will walk 2 miles or more without thinking about driving. W5 is like a great American Main Street, which is what you walk maybe 3/4 of a mile without driving. W4, this is the one place where the quarter mile radius works. On a good neighborhood street like this, and W3 is a less dense part of the neighborhood where the houses are further back and further apart. And there you simply will, you might walk a 1/10 of a mile. On a regular subdivision street, which is W2, you'd be lucky to walk 250 feet. That's why people normally know so few people around them. Everybody else in the subdivision is not a neighbor, it's a subdivision cohabitator. Okay, they live there but they don't know them. W1, It's that parking lot where you'd be lucky to walk 100 feet. In this W0 is a completely unwalkable condition. Now, there is a sidewalk there, but with an arterial here and a parking lot there, the only person who ever walks there is somebody whose car broke down. Okay, other than that, nobody else will. Now, there's some tools, some walk appeal tools. I'll just mention a few of them. One of them is, the derivatives call it a terminated vista, but that sounds like somebody got killed. I like to call it a goal in the middle distance, because in those inevitably less interesting parts of the streetscape, if there's something you can see a long distance away, then it could draw you on to keep going. It can't be as far as a mountain, but a building works fine for that. One of the essential tools is on-street parking. If these cars were not sitting here still, there's no way that this sidewalk cafe could exist. It just simply, if those cars were zipping by at 35 miles an hour, you're taking your life in your own hands. So the more you can get that back on the streets, the better. There's some rules about storefronts. Some storefronts have a problem of having not enough glass. You ought to have about 70% glass at eye level. This one has the problem of having too much glass, where there's, it's just butt glazed glass, and so that actually is pretty boring as well. As you can see, the further you look down here, the more reflection you get. You can't really even hardly see in there until you get back here pretty close. But this does not encourage you to keep on going. And then one other thing about the ideal storefront is one that reveals more and more of itself to you. Down here, the piers are pretty close together and you can't see it. What this does is it pulls your attention to the shop window right beside you, which is more effective. Now, a really important thing, and that is that basically almost all of walk appeal is a result of what happens in the frontages, namely the public frontage, which is to the property line, and the private frontage, which is property line to building face. And there's several parts of this, from street trees and furnishings, sidewalks and so forth. But the one thing that makes up as much of the frontage with which walk appeal is gauged is actually the building face, which is where we all come in, because I say we all, but all of those who are architects are studying to be, because that's our job, is making a building face that actually is something that entices people to keep going, as opposed to not. Here's how important this is. This is St. Charles, Missouri. I picked a random shop on the main street, which is really pretty good, and I ran a walk appeal diagnosis to see where does the walk run out. In other words, how far around can you pull customers from? And there's some areas here, when you have a bad condition, it just kills it very quickly, whereas they could have kept on going. If you do nothing but just simply heal the frontages, get them to be what they should have been, look how many more customers you pick up. If you increase the walk appeal 1W zone, then look how many more that you get. So it really can make all the difference between a business failure and one that is thriving in a walkable neighborhood. There's really no bigger determinant of economic vitality in a walkable place than walk appeal. That same thing also applies to public health as well. This is getting to be a widely known thing. And a lot of urbanists have helped to contribute to the studies that have gone on that shows without a doubt that those who walk 10,000 steps a day are going to be better off on the average than those who don't. Very quickly, a serviceable place is one where you can get those basic services of life within walking distance in your neighborhood, and the people serving you those services can afford to live nearby as well. Now, the first half of that we sort of figured out again. The last half, there needs to be more work done to really get that figured out. A securable place is one where at those inevitably less secure times in every city's future that you can secure the most vulnerable parts of the block, like the interior, like this Muse Court, leaving all the streets open for everyone to travel down. One of the worst things we can possibly do, and we're doing all over South Florida, is building an entire fabric of urbanism that is nothing but gated communities. And those are horrible for secure building. If a building cannot be loved, it will not last. It does not matter what the LEED rating of the building is once its pieces are carted off to the landfill. Okay? And here's an illustration of that. I did that. I wish I'd been able to figure out how to do this several years before I did. But anyhow, USGBC published a report that said that their buildings, in the average of LEED buildings, were 28% more efficient than a non-LEED building. And so that's the difference So basically what I did is that's the difference between these lines, that's a 28% difference in carbon impact per year. Now, the stair steps down are what happens if you don't build a livable building. And, because livable buildings, as soon as we can, we'll get rid of them. We have a long history of doing that. And so, a tract house might last 60 or 70 years. A Walmart might last only 8 to 10 years, until they've gotten their benefit out of it. And so this is the energy to tear down, energy to build, and the embodied energy of the new materials. And as you can see, the yellow line is a livable building, but it is non-LEED. And as you can see, it tracks along for 200 years, is right along with twice as good as LEED. Okay, so if there's ever any doubt, do you do something with a good rating or something that is lovable, by all means do something that's lovable. The high standard, of course, is to do both. Let me illustrate this another way. I have a lot of classicist colleagues who plead for the high standard to be beauty, and I agreed with that for a long time, but I don't anymore, and I'll tell you why. What would not be obvious at all, this is my wife Wanda, what would not be obvious at all is that we have shared love about as equally as any two people do for coming up on 38 years now. But what is exceptionally obvious from looking at the picture is we do not share beauty equally. Had it been up to beauty, I'd have had no chance with her. Okay, so because but love did for me what beauty could not do, and I would suggest that is why it should be a higher standard. This is like this totally unknown stranger on a balcony down in Cuba. Beauty can be warm and engaging at times. She smiled, I took a picture, she gave me a thumbs up, so I guess it's okay to use the picture, even though I can't speak her language. But it can also be cold and hard and sad at times as well. This is another puppy, Sally, but I'm using this to illustrate the point that, when you see something beautiful, it moves us to admiration, okay? But when you see something that you love, it actually moves you to action. And so that's why lovability is a broader standard than beauty, because it actually moves us to act. There's three general sources of lovability: things that reflect us and delight us and put us in harmony with the world around us. Those things that reflect us, there's things that reflect the human form, the human hand, the culture of our region, or the culture of our nation. Now, one of the things about reflecting us is the overall shape and proportions of the human body. Now, I was going to illustrate this by modifying this image as I've done on the next slide. We've seen this guy sitting there totally naked for 500 years. We have him on t-shirts and coffee cups and all this. But just as soon as I try to illustrate the reflection of a window pane with the, it's proportion to the human face, now all of a sudden he's a flasher. That's terrible. But entire elements, not just pieces of elements, should reflect our proportion as well. We need vertical doors. A horizontal door is something you would roll through. A vertical door is something that respects the standing human form. Or we're arranged in a certain way horizontally. Unless someone is terribly disfigured in a horrible accident, they won't ever have, you can't just throw one eye on the other side of your nose. About our middle, we're generally bilaterally symmetrical. We also are arranged in certain ways vertically. We have a head and a body and feet. And if you look at any of the classical orders, that they will have, almost any of them will have an entablature and a column and a pedestal. If you look within those pieces, you have the same three-part division in here as well. Then the things that delight us, and the several types of delight that we'll go through. It can be just simply a very sensual delight, like the beauty of this frontage garden. It can be simply the delight of warmth on a cold night, of a cooling breeze in the summertime, delightful sounds, delightful sights. There's also something that I call group delight. Now, the earliest form of group delight were buildings of worship, where people would come together and worship. But in more recent times, or slightly more recent times, there's sports venues for group delight. There's places of political assembly and places of social assembly as well. Then there's also what I call memory delight. Now, if you inhabit a place where everything is the same in every suite, it's hard to hook a memory there. it's really important to be able to say to someone, remember what I told you about several years ago that happened to me? Here's where it happened right here. But if the only way you know is by a suite number, then that's not nearly so effective. Intellectual delight is something that we as architects are actually quite good at. Unfortunately, most of that intellectual delight, most of our work towards that is spent to entertain each other, but not the public at large. We simply, all we need to do is simply make it a broader form of delight that has at least a level of whatever the thing is, a level that the regular person on the street can appreciate. They don't have to understand all of it, but there has to be a level that they can. Sheltering delight is things like an embracing space, like a courtyard that kind of protects us from the outside world. Then there's a challenging delight. These are places like a port of embarkation or a high point that you climb up to, maybe a tower, something like that. These are, you might call them bracing spaces, like this one with the spider over the door down in New Orleans. Then there's the things that put us in harmony with the world around us. The most famous of these, of course, would be mathematical harmony. That's one that we understand better than some of the others. And of course, this diagram you all know. But when I was in school I was in school from 78 to 83, and at that time, our professors told us that the ancients had some systems of proportion that they used to make their buildings more beautiful, but they didn't tell us what they were. And I thought it was almost a mystical thing. Imagine my surprise later on when I found that many of these were actually very simple mathematical proportions. 1 to 1, a 2 to 1, 3 to 2, a 4 to 3. There's also there's some irrational ones as well, like the golden mean, for example, square root of 2. But once I found that out, then it's actually fairly simple to make at least the principal rooms all proportion to one of those proportions. It's not as easy to do it in the third dimension because we deal with industrial materials. Concrete block is 8 inches tall, standard stud heights, and so forth. And then another source of harmony is simplicity. Now there's several types of simplicity. You will say this is a Tuscan bean soup, which is a very simple vernacular meal in Tuscany. But if you visually, that image is anything but simple. It's got a lot of different colors and textures going on. And so the be simple to use or simple pleasures or things that work simply in elemental things. And then actually, I don't have time to talk about the last one, but let me get to the rest of these. This is a 6x6 post. It has cracks in it, you see. You say, well, my post is messed up. You're going to have to replace that. And no, wait a minute. What that is a sign of depth. This is not something that is a thin veneer on top of some other structural material hidden underneath that will eventually delaminate and be much worse. This actually means that this is the real thing. Then there's also the authenticity versus perfection. Actually, that was the illustration. Sorry, I didn't need to put that one in. There's also harmony with natural processes. And of these, there's harmony with natural laws is one of those. And the law of gravity, obviously, it's not good enough to make something that will stand up. We need to make it where it also looks like it will stand up as well. That one storefront of I think it's the Art Center, that had the storefront that was just butt glazed glass. It looks like the entire building will collapse on you. We all know that it won't, but people on the street don't necessarily. And then the laws of thermodynamics. And of all the things that our descendants will ask about us, of what were they thinking, this will be the biggest one in about 100 years. The smartest glazing in the world is not as efficient as a 2x4 wall with R11 insulation and the cheapest possible finishes on each side. But yet we have put this material all around skyscrapers, and nobody cares until they get the utility bill, and then of course it's horrendous. Then there's also harmony with natural forms. Now, any architect that proposed to use a human form or plant form or animal form on the buildings today would be laughed out of the room if the room is filled with architects. But actually, if it's filled with regular people, then millions of them go and see, actually that's the Louvre, each year. And so we need to ask ourselves, is it possible to maybe somehow engage with natural forms again. I'm not saying how, I'm not saying what, I'm just asking the question is all. And then this harmony with the region. Let me illustrate it this way. Say you're from Beaufort, South Carolina, where the architecture there is well attuned to the low country conditions, and you go to Pienza, Italy, and you say, wow, this is wonderful. I've never seen this before, but I love it. You know, it just resonates with you for some reason. Unfortunately, in the U.S., what we do is we say, well, everybody should have whatever they want to have, but when you do that, it looks completely ridiculous. But unfortunately, there's a lot of places that we build. This is a problem that we as new urbanists have, okay? I'm owning that problem because we have a lot of places with stuff that is as jarringly different as that is. Now let's think of another aspect of the region, and that is that that explains how this might happen. When you have many memories that kind of hook you to home, that help that to be lovable to you as well, your home region. But I think you're more wide-eyed when you're away, and so that actually, I think, helps explain why you can fall for a place very quickly, even though you've never been there before. You know, what is it? I think that actually, if you think about it, for most of human history until now, that actually I'll get to that in the next slide. But anyhow, you know, part of it is the light of the place and how you cool the heat or warm the cold, or take shelter from the storm. And so I think that what happens actually is that we have baked into us strong natural instincts to find the place most suitable for that region, because for almost all of human history, where you take shelter that night in a place you don't know may have a lot to do with whether you're alive in the morning. You know, and so I think it's just a basic human survival instinct. Okay, if a building is lovable, then it needs to be durable enough to carry that lovability long into an uncertain future. Now, there's some problems with that. You know, one of the most terrifying things to a manufacturer is to get commoditized. You know that's kind of the end of your business if you get commoditized. And so they're all working to make things that are just totally specific to their company, but you don't even need to have the company go out of business to have to remove the entire assembly. If they just take that item off the assembly line and it's no longer available, then if a piece of it fails, you got to rip out the whole thing. And so the proprietary products are a real problem. You know, people say, I want to have stuff that is maintenance proof. No, actually you don't. Maintenance proof actually means that you can't maintain it. Or maintenance free, excuse me. Maintenance free is maintenance proof. And what you want is stuff that is patchable and repairable, so that when something fails, as it always will, you can actually patch it. On the left side is some vinyl siding, and something happened to a couple of pieces of it. I don't know what. Maybe the dog gnawed it off. Maybe somebody set the charcoal grill too close and melted it or something like that. But whatever the case is, even if you have some of this stored up over the garage, you know, for 15 years since the house was built, you can't just put it on the wall and replace it, because it'll be a mismatch, because this has been weathering, that has not. And so what you have to do is either have the mismatch or rip it all off, cart it all off to the landfill, and start all over again. Here, back in Pienza, is a place where, as you can see, the opening once went from here to about here. Later on, for some reason, for some interior reason, they moved the opening over to here. But because it was built with solid materials, it actually, even after the finishes are failing, it has a certain, I'm going to drop the C-bomb here, I'm just warning you, but it's a certain charm to it that actually in Vegas, they pay people millions of dollars to make stuff look like that. Why can't we just build it in a natural way and let nature take its course in a good way? And actually, I'm sitting here drinking from one of these right now. Actually, it's that exact bottle almost. But it would be great if we got back to the point where every building actually had cups and glass cups, or glasses or ceramic cups, and a way to wash them, and someone in the building committed to doing that, so we wouldn't have to drink out of these things that actually have only one use, and then they go out to the Pacific and swim around for forever. Another thing to think about with durability is how do we attach things to the shell? Because here's the problem, is that if you have like a an aluminum storefront or curtain wall component, how many times can you screw into that and then move a partition and leave it open again? I mean, you have to, basically all the screw holes, you have to have somebody come in with auto body experience to actually get that looking new again. You know, that's a lot of work to be doing as opposed to other more solid wall types that you can attach to. Take the partition off and move it somewhere else in the future, and you don't have a major problem. It's easily patchable. People say that we should not be using masonry buildings because of the carbon impact. But if the building is also lovable so that it stays there for 400 years as opposed to 40 years, you're actually stretching that impact for a very long time. Let's think about the materials themselves. The first question is, how do they age? That I kind of alluded to earlier. And the real question of that is, how will your building look as a ruin? In other words, over centuries or millennia, you know, what's the condition of the place? Now, we have a very strong misunderstanding of strength and durability. This was a bridge that was installed in the Bahamas less than 10 years before I took the picture. But as you can see, that there's rebar hanging all out the bottom because of the fact that place takes a lot of salt spray from the ocean. And so that bridge was very strong, but it was not very durable at all. So we don't need to ascribe one attribute, both attributes to one material necessarily. I was flying into New York about a decade ago to do a lecture. Just driving by quickly in a cab, I saw all these strange decorative patterns on the side of the building. Quickly I stuck my camera out the window and got a few shots off before we went by, only to realize later what had happened. These are where all the shelf angles are at each level. And what obviously had happened is the shelf angles had rusted. And so instead of, they didn't want to, on a 20-story building, they didn't want to take all of that off and of course the risk to everyone below. So they painstakingly went in there one angle at a time and made a little triangle, as you can see, that would be self-supporting, and took out one piece of shelf angle at a time and replaced it. What an amazingly costly way of taking care of the problem, because of the fact that the brick was used as a skim, not actually as a brick wall. This is I think, 160-year-old or thereabouts building in London, where it actually is a bearing wall brick building, and it could be there for another 160 easily, and probably a lot longer than that. We've done a lot of work recently with carving into walls. We do that because my partners and I, we do a lot of work in the Southeast and in the Caribbean. And so what we're doing is, by carving into the wall, we're trying to have one less cavity that isn't exposed to open air. So in other words, it doesn't mold and mildew like it would if it's closed air. We will even carve into roofs. And basically what happens here is that because the roof is insulated, it's isomine insulation, it allows us to have the attic decking on top, but nothing on the bottom. And so you get the perceived additional height, plus it's much more interesting than a sheetrock ceiling. We will carve into ceilings as well. That's the second floor decking. And that's not some decorative fake joist, it's actually the floor joist that supports the second level. We'll do that same thing in porch ceilings as well. Again, it's all the deal about keeping the moisture out. And fire, if you think about that, there's a number of materials that fare very differently, from plastic and vinyl at the very worst to stone at the very best. There is, well, as you can see, vinyl siding blamed and house fire spread to the house next door, so we're really close together, but still, that's a problem. Here's two guys cooking their dinner outside the hotel. There's the fire, there's the vinyl siding. Guess what happens next? Timber and steel after a fire. This is the famous photo from years ago. You see the timber beam supporting the melted steel beams because it has longer durability in the fire. Anything that you need instructions to operate is less likely to endure for a long time. This is an office building I was in. I walked into the lobby, and there was no way out of the lobby until I noticed, oh wait, here's a sign. It says elevator. It's, oh yeah, sure, that's a beautifully disguised door. And so I went through the door of the elevator and met with the people I needed to meet with. Self-evident operation is the best thing. As we all know, if you raise the bottom sash, lower the top sash, in the cool of the day, in the early evening, the hot air will go out, warm air will go out, and cool air comes in, and you don't even need a breeze to make that happen. I will suggest to you that the life of any item in your building is inversely proportional to the thickness of the manual. Okay, the thicker the manual, the less likely you are to have that for a long time. What's your margin for error? A steel lintel only needs to be forgotten about, on a painting schedule one time to begin to rust. And once it begins to rust, how much of that needs to erode until you actually end up with something that can't support. So let's think about the time frame. These are buildings that have been there over 2,000 years. There is what I'm calling a Millennium Standard, and it basically is based on the idea of the life cycle cost. Now, you won't see all the benefits yourselves, but if a regular building is designed to last 50 years, then you're paying for 2% of that building every year. If it costs about twice as much to build a 1,000-year building, okay, give or take. But over 1,000 years, that's 0.2% per year. It's 1/10 as much on life cycle cost. Adaptable buildings are important because if a building is lovable and durable, it needs to be adapted to be many things over time, not just one thing. As you see, this started out as a Savings and Loan, it's now Banana Republic, but as you can see from the holes in the wall, there's been other signs there as well in between. One key, the biggest key to adaptability is actually the proximity to the street. If you have a building 5 miles off the street, it can only be a very wealthy person's mansion with the 5-mile driveway, or the explosives factor that when it blows up, it won't kill anybody else other than the people in the factory. But the closer you get to the street, the more things it can be. Also, the ceiling height's adapted to the region. I serve as what is similar to a town architect. I do design review on new buildings at the University of Alabama, and there's some buildings there that have some dorms that have been torn down recently for no other reason than they have 8-foot ceilings. Now students won't tolerate that anymore. Back in the 60s when they were built, or 70s I guess it was, that was kind of just a standard. How simple is the massing? The horse and groom here, at one point in time, the horse slept downstairs and the groom slept upstairs. Now, of course, it's a pub, and the building can be used for many other things as well because the massing is very simple. The more fit hand to glove a building massing is, the fewer things it can be used for. So trying to do a good building, not just a good particular building type. How simple is the massing? All my years in school, one of the first things the professors would ask was, tell me about your circulation. And they weren't talking about blood flow or nothing. But I maintain that we as a profession have had freeway envy for a long time. And so we want to express circulation. This guy here, not only built the stair and the elevator on the outside of the building, but made the building reflective so you could appreciate them all over again. So, but the simpler the circulation is, the more adaptable it is. Also, how about pipes? Do we have a system for handling services in the future that don't exist yet? That's what happened here. They built the building before indoor plumbing became common. And so I've even had, as running a normal practice years ago in Huntsville, Alabama, I had had people come in and say, I'm going to tear this building down because it's never been air conditioned. I want you to design me a new building. I said, you're kidding me, aren't you? I said, no, I'm serious. I said, this can be adapted, if we're smart about it. They said, no, I don't want to do that, so you need another architect. Okay, if a building is lovable, durable, and adaptable, it really must be frugal, because there's nothing worse than a lovable, durable, adaptable energy hog, because people join arms in front of the bulldozers and say, oh, no, you don't. You can't get rid of it. So it really needs to be all of the above. Really, really important thing. For the history of the thermostat age, back to when they were first invented, what we've done is we've figured the load, sized the equipment, and conditioned the buildings. Let me ask you a question. Do you see anybody suffering over here? Okay, they're all sitting there on the streets of Paris having some kind of refreshment, but what they're also doing, whether they realize it or not, they're conditioning themselves to the local environment so that when they return indoors, they might be able to just flip the equipment off. So we need to condition the people first rather than conditioning the buildings first. By that I mean let the conditioning of the people help carry most of the load. Today we have thermostat wars all over the country, over 2 degrees on the thermostat. Our ancestors, actually my grandparents, they would have it around 60 degrees, they'd put on a sweater, around 90 they'd have little handheld fans they'd pull out, but they had like a 30-degree comfort range We're told that the comfort range is 10, but literally we have thermostat wars over this. The high ideal is what I call living in season, and that is where you get so conditioned to the local climate that you can actually throw the windows open. And what you'll find is that there's no equipment is so efficient as that which is off. Okay? So if you can condition yourself, that actually works. I moved to Miami almost 14 years ago, and I've had people that have come down there from where I was from, and they're sitting there and they're just sweating, they're suffering, you know. And I'm sitting there totally conditioned, literally because I moved down there in the fall and had the wintertime to get conditioned. I can accurately say that I have never been outdoors in the shade and in the breeze and ever been uncomfortable. But this is in the town where the basketball team is named the Heat. Okay, so you know, it actually works. You do that by enticing people outdoors into a great public realm of streets and plazas, squares, greens, parks, and playgrounds, or into a great private realm of gardens and courtyards. And think about this. If you were to design more of the landscape around the building as a series of garden rooms where you can go out and enjoy, as opposed to spend money to sweat, to mow once a week, wouldn't that be a more enjoyable thing to just simply be sitting there? Beginning with Hurricane Katrina, there was a lot of us that were involved in the Katrina Cottages initiatives, and there's some things that we learned about building smaller and smarter. Number one, small is the new luxury. When my wife and I first built a house years ago, it was a 3,000-foot house. We struggled to even get sheetrock on the walls. You know, recent graduate, we weren't making that much money, all that. We downsized into a 1,500-foot house, and now we live in a 747-square-foot condo in Miami Beach. You can see there's obviously materials here that are better than sheetrock, not because we hit the lottery, but simply because there's so little of it that we can afford to do that. So really small really is the new luxury. Here's some ways of doing that. Think about this. If you go to a restaurant, would you rather sit at a booth or a table? Most people want to sit in a booth. Now a booth, you can seat 6 people in a booth in roughly 36 square feet. Actually, it's a little less than that. Seating those same 6 people in a table, at a table with room to serve around in a dining room is about 5 times that much square footage. Why don't we give people what they'd actually prefer and save 80% of the space? Here's another idea too, and this is one of the Katrina cottages that was actually installed near Washington, D.C. as an exhibit. It's an insulating bed alcove. The idea is that during the day you leave the curtains open. If the curtains are heavy enough, you close them at night, and you can cut the thermostat down unusually low because body heat will keep that warm. Why not store stuff under the bed? Also, why not use spaces, this is a custom living idea house we did, like the space under a stair that's normally lost is kind of a night nook. Also, what we do all the time, we don't even do closets anymore, we do a series of armoires because that saves basically 4 inches front and back every time that happens. You don't think it's that much space, but when you're doing that over the course of a house, it can actually add a couple hundred square feet to the house if you look at in every bedroom. We do boarded walls because it allows us to attach stuff everywhere, not just where the studs are. We will also do shelf walls, you know, where we carve into a wall. Why not use that space for storage as opposed to simply letting it be wasted? One thing that took me years to figure out after the Katrina cottages was, you know, that people just gravitated to them very strongly, and I couldn't figure out the attraction for a long time. But I finally figured it out like 2 or 3 years later. If you look, you know, a teddy bear or a bear cub is so lovable that every American child has to have one within 2 weeks of being born. They don't know that, but the parents know that, you know. But the mother bear is so terrifying. Nobody wants to be within a half a mile of her. What's the difference? It's all in proportion. Okay. What happens is that the infant proportions of both humans and most mammals are actually very different. As an infant, I would have only been able to reach to the top of my head because my arms are shorter. Now I can reach the ear on the other side. Another thing that happens is that you have your eyes, if you look at your baby pictures, your eyes were larger as a baby than they are now. The eyes don't grow as fast as your head does. And so what I realized about the Katrina cottages, when you make them so small, that some things can't get smaller than a certain point. Like you have to meet fire code with the windows for egress, you know. And so the windows were larger than they normally would have been on the house. You know, the proportion was different. And so I think that this is actually, because it spans across, not just humans, but across most mammals, that I think it's nature's way of endearing us to the very young, so that if they're screaming their head off at 3 in the morning, we won't just throw them out in the yard, you know, and then we cease to exist. You know, so I think that's what it is, but anyhow, I call that the teddy bear principle. And then some other things as well. Whenever you can have, make a building of thin wings, then not only daylighting but also cross ventilation is just a complete no-brainer. The more lower processed materials you can use, the better. These materials take some energy to process, of course, but aluminum takes far more. It takes like, what is it, 50,000 BTUs to create 1 pound of it, I believe it is. And so whenever you can use materials that require less processing energy, that's a great thing. Recycling is great. Reuse is far better. It really is an important thing. Also, another thing we learned is that in the Katrina Cottages initiative was the good of not being redundant, but actually having multiple uses instead. And so if you can do one thing that does 3 jobs, that's better than having 3 things to do 1 job like all of the mansions do. It's really important to discard a lot of conventions. When I first went to work for an architect, we did some residential work, and one of the things he said, absolutely no windows on the bedwall. But what I've noticed over the years is that the most delightful bedrooms I've ever woke up in are generally the ones where the morning light is streaming right in across the pillow. It's like, well, how can that be? And but that actually is the case. So that's one convention that actually needs to be discarded for several reasons. Here's another thing about it that I've noticed, and that is that if you have, let me tell you a story quickly. My business partner, Eric Moser, designed a house in Habersham, South Carolina, and he had 1 bedroom. It was like 8 feet by 9 feet. And had he had a single window in that bedroom, the child would be saying, what are you doing, make me sleep in the closet? But because it was surrounded by windows like this bedroom was, then it allowed it to be that way. And the kids were fighting over who got to sleep there. So the more light you can get in, the smaller the rooms can be. So that's the trade-off. So the bottom line is this idea that what we really want to do is put the buildings back to work again for the first time in roughly 100 years. What we've been doing, of course, is letting the equipment do all the work. But you know, if you look here, these are breeze modulating devices. This is a light modulating device. And again, dropping the C-bomb again, the things that help the buildings condition themselves were actually typically some of the most charming things that happen in architecture. So the general rule then is to be frugal naturally first, and then to bridge the gap on those most extreme days of the year with equipment that is more efficient, because you'll need it then. Let's go back to this image. This is the next to last slide. Over time, we've identified some things that we sort of have figured out how to do. Like I say, there's some gaps here, some things that we don't know how to do yet. If you look over here, you'll see that Gizmo Green actually has a role to play in frugality. By all means, if you have equipment, have efficient equipment. You know, don't have something that's inefficient. But my big point is that because so much of the focus on sustainability today is on just Gizmo Green, basically they're missing the big picture of what sustainability is all about. And thank you all so much. I appreciate you coming.
Thank you for that Gizmo Green finish up for it.
Sure.
Thank you.
And if anybody has any questions, I'll be happy to take. Oh, sorry, yeah.
A lot of your images and examples were from urban environments in Western Europe. How do you feel like you can maybe apply some of the things more specifically to an American city? Like you've been pointing out American cities often as the villain, or maybe not the villain, but like poor walkability or walk appeal. But how would you change that?
You know, I get that question a lot, and rightfully so, because I do use a lot of European images.
Yeah.
But when you look at some of those, like that W5 Street in Paris, that is just so enticing you want to just walk for miles, we don't yet do much of that in the U.S. And my point of using those examples is to say, why not? You know, if it performs substantially better, why can't we do so? Why can't we learn the lessons from those and do things that perform better as well? you know, because there's some things we do well, and there's some things that we haven't gotten there yet. And so I look in every place I've traveled at I look for high standards, and then ask myself, why am I not doing that?
Steve, I give lectures at universities around the country a fair bit too, and what my concern that I see in a lot of schools is this disconnect between what the original green building was and what I see being taught in the universities now. You nailed it. My term is green by design instead of green by gizmo. Do you have any idea why the universities seem to be pushing so much the technology approach instead of the green by design approach?
Part of that didn't originate with the universities. Part of it originated in industry. You know, where the manufacturers of various products, you know, they're looking for any way possible to get in the door. The best possible thing is to get to the students while they're still in school. And so that is a very, very strong behind-the-scenes influence that may not be obvious to the students, but that definitely happens. And here's the other problem. A lot of the things I'm talking about here, and other things that I haven't talked about, like, for example, the idea of a gift to the street. If every building gives a gift to the street of some sort, that street will be a much more pleasant place to walk down, and you know, people will walk more. And a gift to the street can be, you know, something that shelters people or entertains them, like a great storefront, or that, you know, just simply gives them a place to rest, like a bench, and there's several other types as well. But those things don't cost the city anything. It's just the individual building owners that are doing these things. And like a lot of these other things, that there's no direct cost. Nobody gets to sell something to, other than maybe the pieces of one of those gifts. But the idea of going outside into a public realm and getting conditioned to the environment. You know, I didn't buy a product to do that. And as a matter of fact, and so when there's no money flow, then, you know, how do you spread the idea? Of course, what I'm trying to do is present it in such a way that it doesn't sound like a graduate level lecture, but it's something that the ideas can spread broadly. You know, there's a whole another way of telling the story, and I've thought about that in the past, of telling it at a much higher level, but that can't spread. And so I keep stopping myself from using that method of communication. But anyhow, sorry, that's pretty much covered that. Yes, sir.
I've noticed strong parallels or resemblance or continuity with what you were talking about and stuff that Christopher Alexander was writing about. And I have the sense that the stuff that he was doing was sort of swallowed up by the academies for whatever reason. And I'm wondering, am I correct in noticing this? Like, are you trying to bring that continuity along? Like, you're using a lot of like defensive sort of tactics and sort of like, you know, saying I'm about to drop the C-bomb and stuff like this. And I'm wondering, are you still finding it necessary to like sort of trying to emerge from within the hostile environment in the academies, or how that's shaping out?
Well, going back to Alexander for starters, you're completely correct on that. I've always been a huge fan. Actually, beginning in
I am too, by the way.
Yeah.
I love this. I love what he says.
Yeah, and I remember when I discovered his pattern language and timeless way of building that was on that same 1980 trip home, and I did very little else other than the trip to Mooresville except to sit there and just completely go through both of those books on that trip. And so, but his pattern language was a broad, really an international thing. It's kind of like it wasn't specific to any given place. In the living tradition books that I do, it's all calibrated to the local place, because if you present general theory to all of us, we all get it, but to the person on the street, that doesn't necessarily resonate. But if you calibrate it to that locality, then it does. And so that's one of the things that I'm trying to add to that long-running discussion that goes back to the 70s. But there was a second half to your question. I forgot.
Oh yeah, the relationship to the academic environment.
Oh yeah, well, the thing is, when I come into a place that I've never lectured before, I never lectured here, and I actually don't know what the local climate is. And so I don't want to come off as being, my ultimate goal, as we were talking about before the lecture, was that, well, let me just tell you this that I told them before we get started. Back in the first generation of modernists, whether you liked them or didn't, you had to admit that their work was very rational. You know, you could trace the loads down, and it all made sense in a very rational way. And but because of that necessity and uniqueness, by the end of that first generation, once you got into the 50s, then it was like 50s and 60s. It was like, well, wow, they took all the rational stuff. What will we do now? And so there was kind of a lost generation that produced some of the most dreadful architecture we've ever seen, especially the poster child is brutalism in my mind. I think we have too much brutality in the world already, and so, but there was a revolt brewing against those guys and then it was all guys. I mean, it was like 2 women in architecture about that time. Our class in 1978, they were so proud because there were 20 women in the class, 20% women in the class is the greatest they ever had. So I say guys advisedly. But so this revolution that was brewing was both Alexander and Leon Creer were kind of at the heart of a lot of it. Creer with his drawings and Alexander with his books. And so the rebels all basically said, I started school in '78, so I was just kind of coming into it towards the end of that time. They were saying, we don't know what we're going to do, but it's not going to be what the Lost Generation did. You know, we're doing something different. And at that time, it was cool to be a Frank Gehry fan and Leon Creer fan at the same time. That there was no cognitive dissonance. It was just you know, they were some of the rebels, and so they were good. But about 1980, I pegged that to the advent of Seaside, and Seaside may actually had something to do with it. But there was a schism, and half of the rebels said, we will be unique, even if it means we can't be rational. The other half said, no, we'll be rational, even if it means we can't be unique. And so the one became the stark taste, the others became the new urbanists and the new traditionalists and the new classicists today. And they've been lobbing hand grenades at each other ever since. Now, one of my core hopes of the original Green was to not do a greenwash job. You know, everybody out there is trying to say my product is the greenest thing, whether your product is a physical thing or an idea. You know, go to the AA convention and look at the steel guys and the brick guys and the, you know, the wood guys. They're all saying ours is the greenest thing. If I were doing an apologist piece for the new urbanism and just tried to prove the new urbanism is sustainable, that wouldn't have worked, because I would be a greenwasher just like the rest of them. So I really had to kind of to put that all out of my mind and think, what are the most essential things to keep things going in a healthy way long into an uncertain future? The number one thing is, if you can't eat here, you can't live here. Now, right now, we get food from all over the world, but long into an uncertain future, once this energy glut based on fossil fuels ends, what happens? You know, there will be places where literally people can't live because they haven't built it into a nourishable place. So anyhow, that led me to a lot of conclusions like that I was not expecting at the beginning. But anyhow, the idea of all of that was to create or my hope anyway, was to create a platform that might be a place of healing for the two sides of the schism that had actually all been my heroes back in the day.
Interesting.
Well, thank you all so much. I really appreciate it. Oh, sorry.
I have one more thing. I'm sorry to be monopolizing.
That's all right.
One more thing I'd like you to speak of publicly if you feel comfortable doing it.
Sure.
What do you think of what Lee has done to the green building movement?
You know, I very much applaud the USGBC for getting these things on our radar. You know, I'm old enough to remember the original Earth Day when I was in middle school. And yeah, I was in middle school. And so we had a green revolution back then, but that revolution was lost because it was all about doing things that just simply, it was all engineering and there was no design. And so I remember very clearly people all over town that put solar panels on the roofs at the right angles and all this in the 1970s and ripped them off in the 1980s. They said, get those hideous things off my roof. I don't care if they are saving me money, I want them out of here, so they cart them all off to the landfill. And so because we missed out on livability, then we lost that revolution. That could happen now. This is a big revolution now. It could be won or it could be lost. Okay? And so, unfortunately, with what LEED has turned into, there's two aspects of that, and I'll talk to both of them. But one thing, because it's almost entirely Gizmo Green focused, it runs the risk of making the same unlovable mistakes. A wind generator generally looks like an egg beater in the sky or something like that. Can it be something that's that's more resonant than that? So they run that risk. But here's the other problem too. LEED has become de facto building code in many places. There's municipalities that's requiring at least certified standards, or some are even requiring silver or gold. And so what is happening there is that it's a massive risk to all of our existing buildings because of the fact that you get almost as many points for having a bike rack as you do for preserving an entire existing building. Now, I served on the LP Tag Committee with USGBC for about a year, I think it was 7 or 8 years ago, and they were in charge of the neighborhood module. And so being an urbanist, I helped. So I've been on the inside for a little while, and I've talked to a lot of the leaders, and they know they have a problem, okay, with the preservation or lack of it, and so. But there's multiple problems there, but those are two at the top of the list. The other thing is that LEED is and this gets back to the money thing. LEED is a mechanism that requires consultants that have to go through a lengthy procedure with which you have to spend a lot of money to achieve results that are not performance-based, but that are aspirational-based. That nobody actually comes in afterwards and actually tests the building to say, how did it perform? And so that's a complex and expensive system. I'm working on something I call the original Green Scorecard that's meant to be a counterpart and also a critique of LEED, and I hope they take it that way. And it's meant to be fast and friendly and free. So what it does is that, where if you look in LEED for Homes, which is supposed to be simpler, if you look at the credit for irrigation, landscape irrigation, it's like 3 pages of fairly complex math. It's not just addition and subtraction. So you have a lot of hoops to jump through. In the original Green Scorecard, there will be a very simple question. What I'm trying to do is define simple indicators of complex conditions. And so the question will be, do the plants you're planting in this landscape require long-term watering in this climate? Everything has to be watered at the beginning, of course, but does it require long-term watering, irrigation? If it does not, you get the credit. If it does, you don't. So there needs to be things that, about like years ago, when I was running a regular firm, I started work in an urbanist place, and of course, if you do a competent takeoff on a house, it can take a couple of weeks. And of course, I didn't have time to do that. But what I did is I spent like a month coming up with some components that included a lot of little stuff, where I counted every screw in every nail and every stud as part of this bigger thing. But then when somebody came in and wanted me to design something, and I did the schematic design, I could actually do the takeoff by these big pieces, counting just a few things in less than an hour. Now, they say that if an architect has an estimate that is within 10%, you're doing good. If you're within 5% of the actual bid price, you're just simply lucky. Well, we got lucky most of the time. So that's what the original Green Scorecard is meant to be, is some simple tests of complex conditions that actually let you quickly get to what is the real performance here. And it's based on 3 things. The first is the performance of the settlement as a whole, city, town, village, hamlet. The second is the performance of the neighborhood. And then the third is the performance of the building. And I call it a batting average. A scorecard, because the idea is a batting average. If you have 90% on your, 100% on your town, 90% on your neighborhood, but 10% on your building, then you're going to be at 09. You know, so it's you know, so you multiply the three. It's not an additive system like LEED where you add them up. Yes.
Do you have time for one more question?
Sure.
Okay. So you started off with we do this because, and as a really good point of departure for figuring out why formal moves are made, and a lot of that sounded pretty great. But then you continue to use Seaside as an example, where as a positive example of new urbanism, where many of the forms end up being chosen for almost homogeneity or tying into historical forms. Do you have any examples, or maybe you probably disagree with that, but do you have any examples of new urbanism, maybe that's not Seaside, that has been successful in doing things more because of response to the environment?
You know,
response to
we
other contexts?
Seaside was done. It was designed originally like 24 years before I finally figured out that we did this because thing. So back then, that was in the days when literally we were wandering around looking for stuff and not even knowing what we were looking for. And the early, actually, I wish I had that slide in this presentation, but I have one slide that takes you through like a dozen buildings built in Seaside over the years. And you can see at the very beginning, it was just literally the first building there was a sharecropper's cottage that they brought in from 30 miles away. Somebody was wanting to get rid of it. And it was just an incredibly crude little building. And over time, it kind of grew from those origins. And so over time, it took literally about, 15, 18 years, somewhere in that vicinity, to fully recover the lost traditions. And that is of just parroting old form. Okay, doing nothing but than what had been done before. You know, people's eyes were so unclear of what they were seeing at the beginning that they didn't even know what to look for. They didn't have names for any of this stuff. If you don't know the name of an element, you don't have enough respect for it to draw it properly. You know, and they didn't. And but when you got about 15, 18 years in, then a funny thing started to happen. That was the first place where architecture started to evolve again. And now in the at Seaside and also all up and down 30A in that vicinity, there's architecture that has never been before, but you can trace the evolution back to some of those first little cottages that were so very crude. It really is a fascinating story. Have you ever spent time there?
No.
You ought to go sometime and have a look. It really is first of all, it's a much messier, dirtier place than people think. They look at all the beautiful photos that some people have done, but it really has a lot of, there's a lot of messy things about it that actually make it a lot more interesting than what it's reputed to be. So definitely go and see. That's, as a matter of fact, to anyone here that's in school, one of my great regrets is that I did not go to Europe or travel broadly at all, really until it was October the 11th of 2001, 1 month after 9/11, that I went for the first time. It's like, wow, I've been missing out on a lot. So travel early and often. Okay, even if you don't think you can afford it or think you have time, you'll always catch up and you'll always find a way to pay for it. You know, so
we actually have a travel abroad program through the Institute of Classical Architecture and Art. If anyone wants to go to Rome, we have tours to Italy, and a lot of them come with scholarships. And specifically, Texas does not have students that apply, so Texas offers scholarships to no students at the moment. So if you apply, you generally have a good chance of getting a scholarship. Hint, hint, wink, wink, everyone. And we do have stuff even in the States. So going up to, New York for the summer, we have a summer studio that's 4 weeks, and if you can't do that, we have a winter class that's a week long, and a lot of times your schools will actually offer you credit for this too. So it's basically like taking a class, getting a scholarship, and going to school for part of the year for free. Very exciting. Sorry to interrupt.
and actually, that first trip in 2001 was actually on the Roman Naples drawing tour.
Yes.
That you all sponsored. So that's. I heartily second everything she said. Actually, a lot of my relearning of stuff was as a result of your educational programs that I've attended many of them. if you go, the very first one you must do, a fellow named Steve Bass does a seminar on proportion, and it's almost a metaphysical session. And you really have to go and do his session. That would be the very first one I do. It's just kind of a mind-blowing thing that you won't ever be the same again after that. Did I finish answering your question?
And new communities, so, like, I think the best thing would be kind of the new revival of some of the campuses where they're putting, like, in downtown areas, of student campuses and things like that. I think that might be something related to y'all, and also reemerging, where they're taking areas of downtown blocks and putting campuses there. Not as similar to Seaside, but definitely would hit home with the students here.
Yeah, there was, actually, you asked about new communities as well. There are some, where once we figured this out about the living traditions, we've actually started to try to implement that. The first big thing I did was, well, actually the very first one was a book. It's a living tradition, architecture of the Central Gulf Coast. But because we just printed that in-house, it's hideously expensive, and so very few people have seen that. But then after that, I was commissioned to do a living tradition architecture in the Bahamas, and where everything is laid out, every pattern is we do this because, and actually, the guy that commissioned it, when he got his first shipment, he called me very excited. He said, "Steve, you won't believe what's happening." I said, "Tell me." He said, "You know, there's a bunch of tradesmen and carpenters out here, and they're going through this first case of books, and they're saying, 'Oh, that's why my grandfather did that. Well, I need to start doing that again.'" You know, and so they actually, because it was explained in those terms, it allowed everyone to think. You know, not just telling them to do this, but here's why. Then there's actually been quite a bit of work in the Bahamas that, informed by the book, that is what the designers come to me and they say, what I've done would never be that good without knowing why that the old folks did it. And actually, everything around the Caribbean rim, there's a Caribbean rim, and then there's an echo rim that basically is the U.S. Gulf Coast that has heat and humidity and hurricanes. And because the regional conditions and climate and the culture, you know, they have this mix of Spanish and French and English, and some of this as well, but primarily those three. But because that whole gumbo is similar, then the architecture is actually very similar all the way around most of the Caribbean rim. But there's little regional differences, but it's actually pretty similar. And the one thing that it does, and the Bahamas are a classic example, is most of the reasons that the architecture is the way it is to survive a storm. You know, I mentioned the roof slope. Also, you notice so many things are hipped there, because a hipped roof, each panel of roof protects its neighbor. You know, you don't have just a gable that has the full force of the wind. And so what happened was that if you were one of the old folks, and by that I mean our ancestors, and you were fortunate enough to survive a hurricane, but your house was not, when you crawled out from under the wreckage of your house and looked across the street and saw your neighbor's house was still standing, you said, "I'm going to rebuild like that." You know, so it is, that architecture is more well tuned to the local environment than any that I'm intimately aware of. I'm sure there may be others around the world in other places that I'm not aware of, but that is a highly tuned architecture, and so that's why that it resonated so well with the builders and also the designers, and they picked it up as much as they did. So yeah, the Bahamas would be the best example that we've done. But again, this is only we're only 13 years in since first figuring out those 4 words, and so it's taken a while to kind of build the tools. But I'm excited about where we're going with it. Thank you.